Which one looks better, A or B? You can probably tell that B is written much better than A, but can you tell me why? If you're not sure, don't worry, because that's exactly what I'll teach you in this video. In my handwriting videos, you'll notice I put a lot of effort into writing pretty strokes or using tricks like slanting horizontal strokes up, angling boxes inward to make my characters look better. But honestly, none of those things really matter, and here's why. There's an important concept you need to know. It's called the 80-20 rule, or Pareto principle. It states that approximately 20% of your efforts yield 80% of your results. And while those numbers may not be as exact as the golden ratio, this pattern does hold true in the real world and can be applied to business, economics, and even learning Chinese. All those things I mentioned before take a tremendous amount of time to master, but they will only improve your handwriting by 20%. Conversely, what I'm about to teach you today is very simple to learn, but will improve your handwriting enormously. So this is it, the 80% of writing beautiful Chinese characters. You ready? The secret to writing neat Chinese characters is proportions. Proportions is not about how each individual stroke looks, but how they all look relative to each other. And that is the biggest factor that will determine whether or not your characters look aesthetic. And today, I will teach you 3 basic principles that I use to find the correct proportions of any character. 那我们就开始吧。A large majority of Chinese characters are composed of multiple smaller components, and balancing those components is critical to make your characters look pleasing. So the first principle is finding the correct ratios between components by visualizing them as blocks within your practice grid. When 2 components appear side by side, which is a very common structure in Chinese characters, the ratio is not always 1-to-1. The radical is often narrower, accounting for maybe 40% of the grid, leaving 60% for the other component. Tracing characters on a practice grid is not a bad way to practice, but don't fall into the trap of blindly tracing characters, because then you are not really improving and just wasting your time. Make a mental note of the correct ratio between components, or even physically draw a line to divide them so you can clearly see their proportions, and keep those proportions in mind as you practice that character. The mistake a lot of people run into here is they tend to make each component a square instead of writing the whole character as a square. This is why wide characters and tall characters are so hard to write. With a 3-part character like zuo, you have to mentally force yourself to make each component tall and narrow so that the character as a whole is a square. The process is the same for tall characters like qi. Divide it into blocks so you can see the correct ratios and write the character with those ratios in mind. The second thing I always look out for is what I'm going to call the longest stroke. It may or may not actually be the one longest stroke, but it refers to the farthest reaching stroke in all 4 directions. So there are 4 points you need to look out for: the highest point, the lowest point, the leftmost point, and rightmost point. All of the extreme points. The reason these points are so important is because they create the outline of the character. Just as the size of this cross is defined by the length of the 2 lines and not the empty space between them, the longest strokes of a character defines the character's size. This is why this character seems wide enough even though only 1 stroke is wide and everything else is quite narrow. Let's take a look at the character Jiao. We can identify these points as the longest strokes, so if we make sure these points are correct, then the character looks fine. But what if we purposely mess them up? Let's shorten all the longest strokes so they aren't the longest anymore. Can you see the difference? The character looks quite different even though all we did was slightly shorten 3 strokes. On more complex characters, the length of every stroke at the edge of the character really plays into the overall silhouette of the character and how well it seems to be balanced. But if you can't get them all right, just aim to get the longest one right, and I guarantee your characters won't look awful. The third and last principle that I look out for are the strokes that touch the 2 center lines of the grid. More specifically, the vertical strokes that line up with the vertical axis and the horizontal strokes that line up with the horizontal axis. You can also look at where nearby strokes are relative to the center lines as well. This will ensure that your characters are centered, because if you can get the center strokes correct, then the position of everything else to either side can't be that far off. Obviously, you will need a grid that has these reference lines. I personally prefer the star grid over the basic cross, because I find the diagonal lines helpful for guiding slanted strokes. By paying attention to this metric, you might also be surprised to find that some strokes you assume to be in the center are actually not in the center. In the character da, the horizontal stroke is above center, and this vertical slanted stroke is also slightly to the left of the center line. The reason I listed this step last is because this should be the last thing you look at, and oftentimes I only use this step as a way to fix a character I can't seem to get right. When you're observing a character for reference, it's much more beneficial to get a holistic view of the overall character than to carefully examine where each individual stroke lines up. The first step, getting the ratio between components, focuses on the general proportions of the character. The second step, observing the longest strokes, focuses on getting the correct outline or silhouette of the character. And the last step, lining up the center lines, helps to fix balance issues between all the little strokes within a character. Of course, there is so much more to writing Hanzi, but if you understand these 3 principles that I'm teaching you today, that will get you to 80% of writing perfect Chinese characters. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. 下次再见了，拜拜。